I realized something was wrong the moment the boarding door clicked shut behind me, not because of anything dramatic. No raised voices, no confrontation. Just a sound, the quiet, deliberate snap of a latch, and the way my fiancé's mother turned to look at me after it happened. Not at the window. Not at the runway lights stretching out into the dark. At me. With an expression I had seen before, though never quite so openly. The expression of someone recalibrating. Someone who had just discovered that the version of me they had been carrying in their head was built on the wrong foundation entirely. But that moment came much later. It came after the drive from Kelowna. After the small talk at the gate. After the coffee his father bought for everyone except me. Not out of malice, I think, but simply because he hadn't thought to ask. Before all of that, I was just a woman standing in a departure hall at YVR on a Tuesday morning, holding my flight bag and trying to decide whether to bring it up now or wait. I waited. My name is Claire. I am 32 years old, and I have been a commercial airline captain for just under 3 years. Before that, I spent 6 years as a first officer flying regional routes across British Columbia and Alberta. Before that, flight training in Abbotsford, a private pilot license at 19, a commercial license at 22, a Class 1 instrument rating before most of my university friends had figured out what they wanted to do with their lives. I did not grow up dreaming of cockpits the way people assume. I grew up near Kamloops, in a house where my father drove a logging truck, and my mother worked dispatch for a transport company. Aviation came to me sideways, through a summer job at a small regional airfield where I swept hangars and learned to read weather charts because there was nothing else to do during slow afternoons. The chief pilot let me sit in the left seat of a Cessna 172 once, just to see. I never really got out. When I met Daniel, I was between contracts. I had just finished a rotation and was spending 2 weeks in Vancouver visiting a friend. He was at the same farmer's market in Kitsilano, looking at a table of heirloom tomatoes with the kind of serious concentration most people reserve for major decisions. We argued very politely about whether the yellow ones were worth the extra $1.50. They were. He was wrong. We got coffee afterward anyway. He asked what I did for work. I told him I flew planes. He laughed a little, the way people do when they think you're being modest about something unrelated, like saying you do some writing when you mean you proof bank disclosures. I clarified. He seemed genuinely interested, asked a few questions about routes, about training, then moved on to other things. He talked about his own work project management for a mid-sized construction firm in Burnaby, and we talked about that instead. By the time we finished the coffee, the conversation had moved to books and the drive up to Whistler and whether the weather would hold for the weekend. He never came back to the flying. Over the following months, I realized it simply hadn't landed the way I expected. I mentioned flights in passing, mentioned overnights in Calgary or Edmonton, mentioned the irregular schedule. He took all of it as background noise. Pilot meant to him the same category of respectable but unremarkable career as teacher or accountant. Not a title, just a job description. I could have corrected the impression. The captain distinction matters in aviation. It is not a small thing. There is a specific weight to that word in our industry, the legal authority it carries, the years of accumulated hours, the certification process, the responsibility, but I didn't correct it, and the longer I didn't, the easier it became not to. Part of it was simple exhaustion. I had spent years in a male-dominated field where my credentials were questioned more often than my male colleagues, where passengers sometimes hesitated at the door when they heard a woman's voice on the PA, where certain interactions at certain airports required a kind of low-grade professional vigilance that I had grown tired of explaining to people who hadn't experienced it. With Daniel, that dynamic didn't exist. He listened to me. He didn't treat me like a resume. He cooked dinner when I came off a long rotation and didn't make a fuss about the schedule. That was not a small thing either. By the time he proposed, on a Tuesday evening in October in our apartment in East Vancouver, it felt too late and also too unnecessary to say, by the way, I'm the one making announcements on the PA. I'm the one the crew defers to. I'm the one Transport Canada holds responsible for everything that happens between wheels up and touchdown. So I stayed quiet about that particular word, not to deceive him. To protect something that felt rare. His parents lived in Kelowna. His father was retired, former sales director for an agricultural equipment company, the kind of man who had built his identity on hard work and visible success. His mother ran a small bookkeeping practice out of their home in the Okanagan and volunteered at their church on weekends. Daniel described them as straightforward people, traditional. The kind who meant well and sometimes didn't notice when meaning well and doing well were different things. He invited me to fly out with him for a long weekend. His sister and her husband would be there too, along with their 2 kids. A family gathering, nothing formal, just dinner and a few days together. I agreed immediately. What I didn't tell him was that I was curious, not anxious, curious, about how they would treat me when they thought I was simply his girlfriend who flew for a living, in the same vague, middling way that people fly for a living. The house was on the east side of Kelowna, backing onto an orchard that his parents didn't own but could see from the kitchen window, which seemed to bring them a similar kind of satisfaction. Warm cedar siding, a covered deck, a row of potted dahlias along the front walk that had been tended with obvious care. It felt like a house that had been earned, and the people inside it wanted you to know that, not aggressively, but in the way it showed in every detail. His mother opened the door and hugged Daniel for a long moment, before turning to me with a smile that was warm and slightly evaluating at the same time. "So this is Claire," she said. "We've heard so much." I doubted that was entirely true but appreciated the effort. His father appeared behind her, wide-shouldered, handshake firm, eyes moving over me the way people do when they are forming an opinion they won't share out loud for at least another hour. "Daniel says you work for an airline," he said. "That's right," I said. He nodded once. "Scheduling? Operations?" "I'm on the flight side," I said. He nodded again, already moving on. "Good benefits in that industry," he said. "Unionized?" "Yes," I said. That seemed to satisfy something for him, and we moved inside. Dinner that first evening was roast chicken with roasted vegetables and a wild rice pilaf that his mother had clearly spent time on. His sister married to a general contractor. 2 kids under 6 dominated most of the conversation in the comfortable way of someone who had always been the more talkative one. Her husband talked shop with Daniel's father about the housing market in the interior. I helped carry dishes from the kitchen and answered questions when they came, which they didn't, very often. The conversation moved to careers in the abstract, the way it does at family dinners when everyone is feeling each other out. His father mentioned a former colleague whose son had become a pilot and then gone into corporate aviation. "Good money in that," he said, "once you got high enough." His mother asked if the airline I worked for was one of the bigger ones. "It's one of the major carriers," I said. "Oh," she said pleasantly. "So you travel a lot?" "I do," I said. "That must make it hard," she said, glancing at Daniel to settle down. I smiled. "It's a schedule you adjust to." She nodded, but her attention had already moved to her grandchildren, who were attempting to eat wild rice with spoons that were too large for their hands. His father asked Daniel about the construction project he was managing. They talked about timelines and subcontractors, and a permit issue in Coquitlam that had delayed things by 6 weeks. His father offered advice with the confidence of a man who has never doubted the relevance of his own experience. Daniel listened with the patience of someone who has long since learned which battles to pick at a family dinner table. I listened too, and I noticed things. The way his mother refilled everyone's water glass except mine, not unkindly, just as though my glass existed in a slightly different category of attention. The way his father asked Daniel what he thought about the airline industry's future, as though I wasn't the most qualified person in the room to answer. The way his sister, when she found out I didn't have children yet, gave me the particular look that means she was filing that information under a heading she had already labeled. None of it was hostile. That was the part I kept coming back to. None of it was hostile at all. It was simply the way a room behaves when it has decided, without discussion, that certain people are worth a certain level of engagement, and others are background. I had sat in rooms like this before. I knew what they felt like. I had learned to stop expecting them to feel different. The next morning, Daniel's father found me on the deck with a coffee before anyone else was up. The Okanagan light was doing its particular thing with the orchard and the low clouds, and for a moment it was genuinely beautiful. He sat down across from me with his own mug and looked out at the view with the proprietary satisfaction of someone who had worked to live near it. "So how long have you been with the airline?" he asked. "About 8 years total," I said. 6 as a first officer, almost 3 as captain. He paused. Not a long pause. Not the kind that happens in films where everything slows down. Just a brief catch in the rhythm of the conversation, like a stitch dropped in a pattern. "Captain," he repeated. "That's right," I said. He looked at me with an expression I recognized as recalibration, the same one his wife had used at the door, but slower this time, more visible. "I didn't realize," he said. I thought Daniel said you flew, so I assumed. First officer, I said. A lot of people do. He shifted in his chair. What aircraft? Boeing 737, I said. Mostly transcontinental routes. Vancouver, Toronto, Halifax, some U.S. destinations. He was quiet for a moment. That's a significant responsibility. It is, I said, and I let the words sit there without softening them. He nodded slowly. There was something in his face that wasn't quite embarrassment, but was adjacent to it. The look of a man who had organized a space in his head for a particular kind of person and was now having to rearrange furniture quickly. I may have assumed, he said carefully, that you were in a more supporting role. Most people do, I said again, and I meant it simply, as a statement of fact rather than an accusation, though I was aware it could function as both. Breakfast was louder than the deck. The kids were awake, and the kitchen filled quickly with the noise of cereal boxes and negotiations about who got the orange cup. Daniel came down looking slightly rumpled, kissed me on the cheek, and poured himself a coffee with the ease of someone who had done it in this kitchen 10,000 times. His father, I noticed, said something to his mother near the counter that I didn't quite catch. Her eyes moved to me briefly. Then she came over and asked if I wanted eggs, and when I said I was fine with toast, she made the eggs anyway and put them in front of me without comment. It was a small thing, but it was different from the night before, and we both knew it. Later that morning, his sister found me in the living room and sat down with the determined energy of someone who had been waiting for a moment alone. Okay, she said. My dad told me. I had no idea. It doesn't usually come up, I said. She looked at me with the candor that only certain kinds of sisters possess. He assumed you were a flight attendant, she said. When Daniel first mentioned you, he didn't say that to you, obviously, but he said it to me. I know, I said. She blinked. You knew? I could tell, I said. From the first dinner. She was quiet for a moment. Does that bother you? I thought about it honestly. It tells me something, I said. Whether it bothers me depends on what happens next. She nodded slowly, processing that. Then she said something that surprised me. I do it too, she said. Assume. I'm trying to be better at it. That was the first honest moment of the trip. Daniel pulled me aside that afternoon while his parents were taking the grandchildren to the park. We sat on the deck with the sun doing its afternoon angle over the orchard, and he asked me, with the particular quietness of someone who has been thinking about something for hours, why I had never used the word captain with his family. I looked at him. You never used it either, I said. He frowned. I say you're a pilot. You do, I said. You've never said captain. Not once, in any conversation I've been part of. He opened his mouth and then closed it again. That fraction of silence was interesting. I didn't think it mattered, he said finally. That's exactly the point, I said gently. He sat with that for a while. The kind of sitting with something that people do when they are genuinely trying to understand, rather than defend themselves. I appreciated that about him. It was one of the reasons I had said yes in October. My dad assumed he started. I know what he assumed, I said, and I understand why. But you knew. You knew what my actual title was, and you described me in a way that let the assumption stand. He looked down at his coffee cup. I didn't do it on purpose. I know, I said. That's what makes it worth talking about. Dinner that second night was different in texture from the first. His father asked me questions, real ones this time, about routes and weather decision-making and crew dynamics and what it felt like to fly into a crosswind at YYC in February. He was genuinely curious, I thought, though I was also aware that the curiosity had been unlocked by a title rather than by me, and those were not the same thing. His mother asked if the schedule was manageable for a woman planning a family. I said that many of my colleagues managed it well, and that the contracts we worked under had specific provisions for parental leave, and that I had thought about it and felt the timeline was mine to determine. She nodded the way people nod when they are waiting for you to finish, so they can feel concerned again later in private. Daniel's brother-in-law asked me something that caught me slightly off guard. Do the passengers ever react when they hear a woman's voice? He asked. Not unkindly. Genuinely curious, in the way of a man who hadn't thought about it before, and was now thinking about it. Sometimes, I said. Less than they used to, more than people think. What do you do? He asked. The same thing I always do, I said. Fly the plane. He laughed. His wife gave him a look that meant she was going to circle back to that conversation later, and I liked her more for it. After dinner, Daniel and I walked to the end of the road where the neighborhood backed onto a small ravine with a trail running through it. The sky above the Okanagan was doing the thing it does in late summer. Layers of amber and slate going all the way down to the hills. "I didn't stand up for you last night," he said, without preamble. I looked at him. "No," I said. "You didn't." "When my dad talked over you about the industry," he said, "I let it happen." "You did," I said. Not harshly. As a fact. He nodded slowly. "I grew up doing that, not rocking the boat at dinner. My dad has a way of filling the room, and I learned to let him." "I understand that," I said. "And I know it's not simple. But I need to know that you'll use the right word," I said. "Not because of ego, because it's accurate, and because when you don't, it tells the room something that isn't true." He stopped walking. We were standing at the edge of the ravine trail, the light almost gone, the city noise from the valley below rising faintly toward us. "I should have said captain from the beginning," he said. "With them, with everyone." "Yes," I said. He exhaled. "I think part of me liked having one space where it wasn't big, where you were just Claire." I understood that more than I wanted to admit, because it was also, partially, why I hadn't corrected it myself. "I'm always just Claire," I said. "The rank doesn't change that. But it does change what the room thinks is possible for me, and I can't keep managing that alone." We stood there for a while in the dark above the ravine, and I felt something settle between us that was complicated and necessary. The flight home was the one that had been planned from the beginning, Daniel and I flying back to Vancouver together, his parents driving us to the airport for a mid-morning departure. His mother had packed a bag of leftover baking for the trip without being asked. His father carried our bags to the check-in counter without being asked either. At the gate, the ground crew recognized me. This happens sometimes at airports I use regularly. A first officer I had flown with twice waved from across the terminal. The gate agent glanced at my boarding pass and said something I couldn't hear, and I leaned in, and she said they were doing pre-boarding in 10 minutes if I wanted to get settled first. His mother noticed. "Do you know people here?" she asked. "I fly through here regularly," I said. His father watched the gate agent speak to me again, watched the slight change in the way the counter arranged itself around my presence, and something moved across his expression that was hard to name. Not embarrassment exactly. More like the discomfort of realizing that a room you thought you understood had been organized differently than you assumed. When the boarding announcement came, the gate agent's voice over the PA said, "We'd like to begin pre-boarding for Flight 204 to Vancouver. We'll start with passengers requiring extra time, followed by Captain Whitmore and operating crew." The name hung in the air of the departure gate for exactly long enough. His mother turned to look at me. His father went very still. Daniel, to his credit, smiled the smile of someone who had known something the room didn't and had been waiting, quietly, for it to find its own way out. "That's you," his mother said, not quite a question. "That's me," I said. I said goodbye and walked toward the door, and I heard his father say something behind me, low enough that I wasn't meant to catch it, but I did. "She's flying the plane," he said, in a voice that held in roughly equal measures surprise, recalibration, and something that sounded, for the first time, like actual respect. The flight was smooth. I handled a bit of weather over the Fraser Canyon, nothing unusual, just the standard dance with mountain wave and terrain avoidance protocols, and brought the aircraft down at YVR with the kind of landing that nobody remarks on because it felt exactly as it should. Which is the goal. Unremarkability, in aviation, is the highest compliment. Daniel texted when I was finishing the post-flight paperwork. My dad called. "He wants to take us to dinner next month when they come to Vancouver. Said he'd like to hear more about your roots." I stared at the message for a moment. Then I typed back, "That's fine. Tell him I'm buying." I put my phone away and thought about what the week had taught me. Not about his parents particularly. They were not unusual people. They had a particular map of the world, one organized by visible output, recognized title, expected trajectory, and I had walked into their house looking, to their eyes, like someone who existed outside the categories that map rewarded. They had been polite. They had not been unkind. And when the map was corrected, they had adjusted, because they were also people of goodwill. Even if goodwill and awareness are not always the same thing, what I thought about more was Daniel. About the word he had left out, over and over, in the months before this trip. Not maliciously, not even consciously. I believed him. But the omission had its own meaning, and we had both needed to see it. There is a version of love that keeps you small to stay comfortable, and there is a version that makes room for the whole shape of you, even the parts that take up more space than expected. I had been in the first version before. It had felt safe for longer than it should have. Daniel called when I was almost home. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told me. "About the word." "I know," I said. "I spoke to my parents after you took off," he said. "Both of them." I waited. "I told them I should have introduced you properly from the beginning, that it was on me, and that I didn't want to do it again." "What did your dad say?" I asked. A pause. "He said he wished I'd said something before he made an idiot of himself at breakfast." I smiled. "He didn't make an idiot of himself." "He knows that," Daniel said. "But I think he needed to say it." I walked up the steps to our building, my flight bag over one shoulder, the October air carrying that particular Vancouver coastal edge that I had grown up associating with home. "I'm going to get it wrong sometimes," Daniel said. "I want you to know I know that." "So am I," said. "That's not the question." "What's the question?" I pushed open the lobby door. "The question is whether you correct it when you do." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes, I will." I believed him. Not perfectly, not without reservation, but enough. And enough, honestly, is where most real things begin. The dinner with his parents in Vancouver happened 6 weeks later, at a Portuguese place in the West End that Daniel chose because his father had mentioned he'd never had bacalhau. His mother brought a card. His father stood up when I came in, shook my hand and said, "Captain." Just the one word. In the middle of the greeting, as though trying it out. Deciding while he said it that it fit. It wasn't a grand reconciliation. No one gave a speech. No one apologized formally or offered a grand gesture. We ate dinner and talked about the weather and the upcoming federal election and whether the Canucks had any realistic shot this season, which they did not. His father asked 2 questions about aviation that were good questions, the kind that come from someone who has done some reading rather than someone who is performing interest. I answered them directly. At one point, his mother reached across the table and touched my arm and said, "You know, I think I may have been more traditional in my thinking than I realized." She didn't finish the sentence, but it was the most honest thing she had said to me in all our time together, and I valued it more than I would have valued an explanation. On the drive home, Daniel asked me if I was happy. I thought about the question. Not about what it wanted to hear, about what was actually true. "Yes," I said. "I think so." "Even with my family?" he asked. "They're trying to be honest," I said. "That matters more to me than being impressive." He nodded. And I thought about something I had come to understand slowly, over years of flying and managing crews and sitting in the left seat of an aircraft with people I had never met, responsible for 180 lives at 37,000 feet. Authority is not about being feared. It is not about being admired. It is about showing up, consistently, with the same level of competence and care regardless of who is watching. The people who respect that tend to be worth keeping around. The people who only notice it when they've been told to those are worth understanding and then deciding what to do with. I had spent a long time managing the distance between who I was and who a room decided I was before I walked into it. Adjusting, softening, choosing which parts of myself to carry quietly and which to leave at the door. I was not going to do that anymore. Not with his family, not with mine, not with the passengers who hesitated on the jet bridge before walking onto my aircraft. I would fly the plane. I would use the right words. And I would let the people in my life decide with full information whether they were capable of standing next to someone they hadn't expected. Because the truest thing I had learned in aviation in all the pre-dawn briefings and weather decisions and late-night diversion calls was this. You cannot control the conditions you fly into. You can only be honest about what you see, make the best decision available, and trust that the training holds. That applies in cockpits. It turns out it applies everywhere else, too. If this story reminded you of a time when someone made an assumption about who you were or a time when you made one, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. These conversations matter. Even the uncomfortable ones. Especially those. And if you believe in the kind of honesty that asks something of all of us, not just the people we disagree with, consider staying around. There are more stories like this one, and every single one of them is worth telling.